And welcome to the 23rd meeting in 2012 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. And can I remind everyone present to please turn off any mobile phones, tablets, electronic devices, etc., including Blackberries. I'd like to welcome to the meeting and to the committee our two new members, Jean Urquhart and Bruce Crawford, who replace Mark MacDonald and Paul Wheelhouse on the committee. And I'd like to put on record my personal thanks to Paul and Mark for all the excellent work and the commitment that they made to the Finance Committee in the time that they were actually here. They will be sadly missed, but I'm sure the replacements will prove themselves to be very effective in their new roles. Our first item of business this morning is to deal with a declaration of interest for both new members, and I therefore invite Jean Urquhart to declare any interests relevant to the remit of the Finance Committee. Nothing to declare. And I would also like to invite Bruce Crawford to declare any interests relevant to the committee's remit.
Likewise, I have nothing to declare.
Thank you very much. Our main item of business today, as we move to agenda item 2, is to begin oral evidence sessions as part of our inquiry into demographic change and the ageing population. We will hold 2 sessions today, and I'd therefore like to welcome to the meeting Alan Sinclair from the Centre for Confidence and Wellbeing. Good morning. Barbara Hurst from Audit Scotland. Good morning. Colin Mayer of the Improvement Service. Good morning. And Professor Elspeth Graham, ESRC Centre for Population Change. The purpose of our inquiry is to identify the impacts which demographic change and an ageing population will have primarily on the public finances in respect of the provision of health and social care, housing and pensions, and the labour force, and the planning being undertaken by the Scottish Government and key public bodies to mitigate such effects. Identification and planning are the key aspects, identifying the budgetary impacts within each of these areas. Also, that the Scottish Government and key public agencies, such as local authorities and NHS boards, have appropriate and active plans in place to tackle them. The inquiry will focus on 3 particular policy areas: health and social care, housing and pensions, and the labour force. I'll allow up to 90 minutes for this session and would like the discussion to address issues across these 3 subject areas. If any of the participants would like to respond to a question or make a point, please indicate to myself or the clerks. Now, we usually, of course, in these sessions have opening statements, but given that we have 4 panellists, we're not going to have any opening statements. So, as normal, I will start by asking questions of the panellists. Now, 3 of the 4 panellists have made submissions, so I'm going to ask each of those in turn, and then Professor Graham to comment. So first of all, Alan, with regard to your own submission, you state that there's a need for long-term thinking and whether we want to continue spending in the same way on health and social care for older people. And you talk about the importance of directing public services to people's specific individual needs and the need for great efficiency in healthcare and housing services. And you talk about some parts of the country have responded to the ageing population. You talk about Nairn, North Lanarkshire and the Borders, where the nature of services is being rethought and delivered in a different way. And you also talk about how in Holland a big problem has been broken down to a human scale with a human touch through what's called the Buurtzorg. So I'm wondering if you can just give us a wee bit of examples and kind of elaborate on what's actually happening in some of these areas that you've mentioned.
Okay, I think the traditional, thank you, Chairman. I think the traditional format that we have of public services is here is a need, and then what can the public service do to fulfil that need? I think when we see the scale and the duration of what's coming our way on health and care, then we need to think of a different model of public service. And the examples I quote are ones where in Scotland and in Holland, the public services have kind of reconfigured themselves so that what they're trying to do is not meet all the needs, but help support individuals to look after themselves better, anticipate the things that could go wrong, and also help their families and neighbourhoods deal with the issues, rather than meet all the needs as a service. And that's quite a different take on the nature of a public service.
So you're talking therefore about, independent living primarily, or people working, together to provide mutual support?
It's in different places, it's different. Let me take you the Nairn example, where in that locality, they have a risk register for every elderly person, so that they know more likely what is going to happen, rather than just waiting for people to come. But they also do, now what do they use as a phrase, but it's a statement of intent from each person. In other words, if I have a severe cancer, then do you revive me or not, if I happen to go? And not only would that be on the records of the doctors locally, it would also be in each person's front room in a container, so that if ambulance men have to arrive, suddenly they actually know what they're meant to do, rather than go through a whole process of trying to, do you revive or not? So I'm just trying to, so that's one example. In the Buurtzorg in Holland, which I think is the most significant piece of reconfiguring of community nursing I've seen anywhere, the community nurses have gone back to basics as to what community nurses for. If you talk to community nurses here, you'll see that they are frequently caught up in lots of procedures and have almost stopped becoming nurses. And the community nurses there get a remit as to what they're meant to do from the doctor. But once they get to know the individual patient, and they get to know them over a few weeks, they get to know who else is coming in and out of the house, what else can the person do, because what they may do may vary over days and weeks because they're elderly and frail or ill or mental health problems. Then they recalibrate, redesign the type of package of care. And quite often they actually end up reducing it, because what they're trying to do as community nurses is help the people look after themselves rather than provide an endless amount of support. So it's a different mindset.
And this philosophy, you believe, is something that we could perhaps emulate in Scotland? What would be the kind of, obviously, cost implications of such a change?
I think the two sides that I see on this one, the way that we are going just now, given the increasing costs of ageing and the number of people who are ageing, the most likely thing is we will have vast amounts of unmet need, because we will just not be able to respond adequately. So on the one hand, it's going to be vast amounts of unmet need. I think the other side that you find on this approach is that certainly in Holland for the Buurtzorg, they find that is, makes an awful lot of economic sense as well as care sense, because it takes people away, makes less people going through to the more expensive, more intensive forms of care. And so you are keeping people in their natural communities longer and doing better. So you're winning on two dimensions here. One is you're meeting a need, and you're also making economic sense.
Okay, thank you very much. Barbara Hurst, you talk in your submission about the lack of good performance information across the public sector, and you say the issue is whether the current system for allocating funding to councils and NHS boards allow them to properly plan for the long-term provision and funding of services for an ageing population. I'm just wondering if you can elaborate on that a wee bit for the committee.
Yes, certainly, Convener. We've done quite a lot of work on health and social care services over the years, starting from very early days of Audit Scotland, where we looked at home care services, aids and adaptations, right through to our more recent work on community health partnerships and commissioning social care. And without fail, I think what we've found through our work is that actually there's a lot of assumptions about what should be happening, but without the clear evidence that actually that is what works in the context. So, for example, there's been some quite interesting research from University of Bristol recently about what helps public bodies working together here, we're thinking about councils and health boards, to reduce emergency admissions. And actually it's quite interesting. So it's not the things that you would expect. So the things that they found were things like telehealth. It was proven to reduce unplanned admissions, improved rehabilitation services. What didn't have a direct correlation were things like hospital-at-home services, home visits, care management for individuals. And I think the interesting thing is there's a separation here because there's things about the performance that you would need to drive some of the financial metrics here. So clearly emergency admissions, very expensive to manage and unpredictable. So you would want to drive that down, particularly in the case of the demographics that we're looking at. At the same time, you want to improve people's quality of life, make them partners in their own care. So the beauty of telehealth services, which is underdeveloped probably, to be fair, in Scotland, although there are some really good projects, but the beauty of that is that actually if people engage in telehealth and they have long-term conditions, there's a much more willingness to manage the condition oneself, to be able to identify what the triggers are which may need an intervention. So there are these things that actually the health service could do now and could do more of. The things around improving people's quality of life, not only older people, but people with disabilities and the like. I think there's a lot going on. Self-directed support will really help there. I think moves towards a much more joined-up approach between health and social care, obviously, is a big win. What I would say, and we've done less work here, but some of the emerging findings, and certainly from other work that other people have done, housing isn't a key player yet at the table in some of that. And I think the early work we did around AIDS and adaptations shows that actually housing has to be brought into this engagement because it's such a crucial part of helping people live independent lives.
So obviously you've concerns in terms of cost activity and the quality of services and the fact that there is good work going on in some parts of the country, undoubtedly, but that information is not being shared and not being effectively audited so that, for example, other local authorities, health boards can assess whether or not that's something they want to implement in their own areas.
I mean, every local authority will know its local circumstances better than anybody else. I think what I found very interesting from the range of submissions that the committee has had is the different levels of planning that are going on. So I noted Edinburgh has a long-term financial plan, which given the circumstances, one would think is pretty good practice, whereas some of the other councils were still working on a 3-year budgeting cycle for their planning, which given the demographics, which Elspeth will know better than any of us, one would think that 3 years isn't long enough to do that sort of planning.
Yeah, so we need to look at things in a much more longer term way. Colin Mayer, I think we were all amused by the opening line of your submission, which says, in the long run, we are all dead. from that was a nice cheery start, you know, and it kind of went downhill from there. You say in paragraph 28 of your submission that the uncertainty associated with projecting future costs of long-term care and other factors of uncertainty described in the report means demand and costs must be reviewed and remodelled regularly. And I think that touches on a lot of what Barbara Hurst has just mentioned. And you also say if costs could be reduced over time, then the volume of demand at a given level of budget given the budget support would increase. And I wonder if you can just elaborate on that for us a wee bit, Colin.
Yeah, I mean, on the profiling, my sense is that there's a lot of good work going on that is very long term. So we can model scenarios for 230 and 260 at UK and Scottish level in some depth. If you say, how do we get through the next 5 years, that's altogether unclearer to me. So in a way, there's a bit here about, yes, having a long-term focus. I absolutely agree with Barbara on that. But if we've no short-term focus about how we make services sustainable as we move into a period of substantial downward pressure, probably in cash terms, in Scottish public service expenditure, then we have genuine issues we will bounce our way through rather than plan our way through. So I think the remodelling almost has to be on a 2 to 3 year cycle that we remodel our assumptions, because they do change over time, and they do change quite dramatically over time. In terms of the cost question, I suppose the point was almost tautological, convener, that if we could, through more effective organisation, procurement, how we manage the workforce and the wage bill, reduce costs, then clearly the volume of care you can deliver at any given cost level would go up. That said, I have to say the care workforce is overwhelmingly made up of fairly low-paid public service workers at the present moment, and therefore the possibility of cost reduction that's purely about cutting their wages and conditions seems to me to be actually minimal and probably counterproductive in some cases, as it feeds into other outcomes that those workers will experience as well. But if you look at some of our initiatives, say on procurement just now, there is an effort to, if you like, increase the hours of care that can be achieved through the procurement vehicles that we're using for a given cost. Barbara's issue of how do we measure quality in that, how do we measure outcome from that, is critically important, because you can cheapen things but you haven't made them better. And if the impact of care in sustaining people's lives is diminished. A final point I'd make is that we are still experimenting, as I've put it in here, with what works preventatively, what patterns of investment have the best longer-term payoff against the demographic trends we're facing. And I think a huge amount of efforts going in across Scotland around reablement. How do you get the right resources in intensively at the right time to restore people's capacity rather than maintain them as dependent for the rest of their lives? I think there's significant merit in doing that. And quite a lot about enablement. How do we support families and communities better in the caring roles they have? Because whatever we say about public services here, the vast majority of caring for older people particularly is done by other older people and by the families of those older people. It is not done by the state, whether in its local government or health service guise. So the enablement of families and communities would have to be a key part of a forward strategy as well.
An important issue, and it's something that we've actually discussed in this committee before, of course, is the issue of universal services. And again, in paragraph 20 on any of your submission, you say there are powerful simplicity and solidarity arguments for universal entitlements, but the arguments for reconsidering these entitlements are also substantial. Non-means-tested entitlements are less progressive than tested means entitlements and preserve rather than reduce inequality. Do you think that's an issue which is going to come more to the fore in the future? I imagine the answer to that will be yes, but do you think that a possible alternative to, for example, reducing universal benefits would be to look at other models, such as, for example, the Buurtzorg model, which Alan Sinclair talked about, to see whether or not we could get the best of all worlds in that regard?
I mean, I think, I absolutely take it that all political parties in Scotland in the last election were committed to quite a wide range of universal entitlements for older people. The crux of the evidence we've put forward is, if you analyse in some depth the next kind of 5 to 10 years, either we are going to make much more substantial cuts in other areas of public service, and I find it hard to see where they're actually going to happen, or alternatively we would have to be tax willing as a country and have the fiscal tools to be tax willing as a country to support what we're doing. I would say there's no, I wouldn't see what Alan described as an alternative to what I'm saying. I think you may need to look at both. How do you use resources more efficiently and effectively, whatever volume of resources we have, but also the question of how sustainable are some of our universal entitlements over time, and is the public willing to pay through fiscal mechanisms, say post-2016, to have a level of entitlement that is not enjoyed in other parts of the UK and indeed not enjoyed in most parts of Europe. So that's a straight political choice, I think, and I think the parties offered that choice at the election. They went out committed to the universal entitlements. 2016, I think, to some extent, well, we have to raise money in Scotland and we have to formally set tax rates for Scotland. If we want to sustain that under demographic pressure, are people willing to pay a bit more in tax to sustain the solidarity and the genuine arguments, which I absolutely accept, for solidarity? Are we willing to pay for it as we go forward longer term?
Professor Graham, obviously you've heard the comments of other members, and although you haven't got a submission, you clearly have a lot of expertise in this area. I wonder if you would like to comment and give your views to the committee on this issue.
Yes, I think you mentioned demographic pressure there, and I think we need to be realistic about what demographic pressure we might be facing, and in particular, how that demographic pressure will vary across Scotland. It will be much higher in some areas than others. At the moment, we have a population in Scotland that is more or less balanced, in fact, between the under 16s and the over 65s. So we've got about 17% under 16s and over 65s, and about 66% in the workforce, or at least working ages, I should say. As everybody knows, that is projected to change, although within a growing population. And the headline figure, I think, that we should be thinking about is particularly the growth in over 75 and over population is going to grow more rapidly as a percentage of the total population, or it's likely to. Having said that, we've got about 0.4 million over 75 at the moment, probably rising to around 0.7 million by 2035. One of the big problems about forecasting or projecting an ageing population is to get that right, because Scotland is very much influenced by migration into Scotland and indeed migration within Scotland. And that's going to change the balance of population ageing in different local authorities. Now, I can go into some of the assumptions that have been made, but clearly what happens to mortality in Scotland, to life expectancy, is going to be important. It has been rising steadily, but as is well known, it is lower than in most European countries. And so if there was a push towards better care, longer life expectancy, then that would have an impact on the numbers of people over 75 in particular. I think that the migration factor is also quite important to the workforce, although a lot of migration into and from Scotland appears to be student migration. So when we're looking at numbers in the over 16 to 64 age group, for example, or in the future perhaps to the 68 age group, then we have to think about taking those students perhaps out of our calculations. Because migration is so important, about 20,000 migrants, a few more last year, coming into Scotland, that's the estimate. It's very difficult to measure that precisely, but most of them are coming in around age 19 and leaving around age 24, so that indicates that they're probably students. The rest are spread throughout the working age groups, but tend to be under 30. So it's quite important, I think, to understand how that dynamic might affect Scotland in the future, and that requires us to make certain assumptions, which are difficult to make. Basically, the next 5 years, we can make a reasonably good guess about what might happen, but the further you get towards the 25-year projection, the more doubtful those assumptions are.
Migration depends on a number of factors, such as the economy. If the economy is growing, it attracts people. If it's not growing, then it doesn't attract people. And so there's a real issue in terms of projection and that, even from year to year. One of the things, though, about the ageing population, which we received in evidence previously to this committee, was that although in 25 years from now, people are expected to live an average of 7 years longer, 4 of those years will be in ill health, in average, and of course there's clear resource issues in terms of that. I mean, how important is it that if we have, as our population ages, the health of older people continues to improve faster than the kind of life expectancy, and is that actually possible? You know, that we can actually, you know, through changes in lifestyle to actually ensure that the quality of life improves, not just the length of it?
I think it's very important to focus on healthy life expectancy as well as life expectancy. There's some evidence, and some people may be able to comment on this, that the last 2 years of someone's life entails the highest expenditure. If we could promote healthy life expectancy such that everybody, or on average, the last 2 years was the most expensive, then we'd obviously be in a better fiscal position. But there's a long way to go, I think. And certainly in Scotland, in some areas, there's a particularly long way to go. I was involved in the evidence submitted by the Royal Society, and one of the pieces of evidence there is about obesity in Scotland and how that impacts on healthy life expectancy. And it seems quite important to think in a joined-up way about that, because obviously those in the working age who are obese at the moment are going to become elderly in the future. And so, yes, very important to think about healthy life expectancy.
So I think I've talked for long enough. I'm going to open the session out to colleagues around the committee, and the first person to ask questions will be Michael, to be followed by Bruce.
Much convener, and a lot of what I was interested in you sort of covered, but as a starting point, I think it's now an established principle in terms of free personal care for the elderly and what have you, that if we don't invest money in that, the consequences and the costs longer term will be even greater than if we don't make that investment. So really what we're talking about in terms of remodelling and preventative spend is about not whether we do it, but how we do it. Would that be correct? Yeah.
Absolutely agree. And I think the link worth drawing out is between the cost of one type of universal entitlement as against the shift in remodelling you're talking about, because my sense is, certainly looking around Scotland's councils, the pressure on free personal care, which is people who now do need care, in others we have not prevented things in their lives, we're now caring for them, the cost of that being universal and free is actually squeezing the resource available to invest in prevention. So that, in a way, there is a tension here now between the cost of reactive services and the model we have, and how you get resources into the preventative services themselves. And absolutely taking the point raised about extending healthy life expectancy, I think we've got a very good strategy evolving in Scotland about how do you target factors that lead to shorter healthy life expectancy and a longer gap between healthy life expectancy and life expectancy. And that seems to be very closely linked to deprivation and community characteristics at the present moment, and you can show that quite systematically. If we want to invest in that, the issue is how do we balance that against a growing pressure on the universal part of the care budget, which is, I think, pulling us across the next 5 to 10 years quite sharply away from some of our investments in prevention. I absolutely take your point, but I think there's a tension there just now that we are not resolving, and it's hard to plan our way through, which is why perhaps we plan for 3 years rather than 10, because it's easier, frankly, to handle the contradictions across 3 than 10.
Sorry.
No, can I just sort of help between the chairman's last question and what you were saying, is that I think we have something that's very sensitive and it's very difficult to deal with. I did a piece of work to help the third sector look at ageing and the implications 2 years ago. And what I became acutely aware of is that deep in the heart of the health services and clinicians is the training and the mentality that you must keep people alive, full stop. And that becomes the primary aim. The more I spoke to old people and looked at old people research, old people wanted a decent life and to have a life worth living. And we haven't yet found a way of reconciling something that's in the heart and the minds of the population and something that's institutionalized in our systems.
Thank you. I'd just like to sort of come in behind what Colin was saying around what's happening at the moment. So we've recently done some work around commissioning social care, and it's very clear that Colin's absolutely right, that the resources are going increasingly into trying to, you know, with the right will and everything, trying to keep people in their own homes for longer, but the money is being spent at the more intensive end, so the preventative bit is being squeezed out. And I think we would argue as well that actually even that spending at the more intensive end, if you're moving to a position, and it's been going on for a long time, of very short periods of home care visits, that's actually not where you would get the best benefit in terms of quality of someone's life, but also maintaining that community engagement. So I think there is something in here around actually needing to find a way through this so that it's a genuine starting with people earlier. And I absolutely take Colin's point. This is really difficult with current financial pressures. I mean, it was difficult 10 years ago when there weren't the same pressures. But in a sense, unless that cycle is broken out of, it'll be very hard to cope with increasing demand on services. And so I think it's not just about looking at the social care budget in isolation from the health budget and the housing budget. So I think there must be some way of breaking through some of that.
I'm glad you mentioned that at the end, because that's where I was going with my next point, because I've spoken to a number of people in terms of healthcare for people at the end of life or towards the latter end of their life. And some of the ideas that are coming out of those specialists and those professionals is that we're spending too much money on acute services because we count the number of operations that are done, we count the number of interventions that take place, when actually we're not improving the life of a person by doing those. There are some cancers which you could operate on, but it could possibly, going through an operation could shorten that elderly person's life, because overcoming an operation is difficult in itself. But the pressure to do that operation outweighs the concern about moving away from acute services to preventative spend. And unless we get out of this short-termism, you can plan all you want for beyond 2016, 2030, 2060. If we don't get the spending right now, we'll never achieve those longer-term plans. So we have to make the changes now, rather than put them off.
Indeed, I agree, and I think that, I suppose, the question then is how do you create space for that culturally? Because if you take the point I think you've eloquently made, we're not good at dying in Scotland. And we're not good in talking about dying, and we're not. 58% of us will die in hospital, which I think is an absolutely horrible statistic, rather than with our families in our homes and so on. So there is a bit here about, if you like, how protracted do we wish to make people's dying, and how protracted do they wish? And often it takes quite a powerful older person to say, no, I don't want this, so do not do this to me. Often there's significant family pressure, understandably, because of commitment to the person, to do anything you can to protract this person's life. So I think there is a bit genuinely that we haven't got to a narrative about dying at all, and what a death service looks like in Scotland that's slightly better than where we are. But I absolutely take your point, unless we can shift something from the acute and reactive end into prevention, we will struggle across the next period, because there will be an overall pressure on the budget, and the budget for reactive services is under stress already. Most councils are tending towards overspends just now this year on their adult social care and older persons care budgets, just because of demand pressures.
Can I just finish up and make an observation which you can either comment on or not, disagree with or otherwise? But isn't it easier for local newspapers, local organisations, politicians even, to stand outside hospitals and facilities with placards saying don't shut our acute service, rather than stand on an empty field and say please build us a local health centre which will prevent death?
Absolutely. And politics oscillates around big facilities, is the honest truth. They attract public support, political support and so on, and we have our discussions narrowed down about keeping this facility open or that one open. I mean, interestingly, someone remarked to me around the new community governance bill going in front of Parliament that the quickest way to get a community together is not to give them an asset, it's to try and take an asset off them. And that will absolutely galvanise them instantaneously. And there may be a new way of community capacity building here.
Thank you, Convener. I'm concerned that we get the starting point right here. What do I mean by that? The information that we've got available, the modelling information that's available to us. I think we can all accept the fact that inevitably the population is getting older, but what does that mean in reality? And I was very struck by Colin's paper and some of the other material and other contributions about the modelling often being crude and greater precision is necessary. But I'd need to think about, if that's the facts we're dealing with now, in terms of the modelling we have available to us in Scotland, does that bring into cognizance things like the change in the no smoking policy, the impact of minimum pricing on alcohol, the changes of welfare policy that's going on in the UK, and not least, as Barbara and Elspeth described, the lack of statistical data and real grip on what's happened in migration. And because I'm concerned that if we don't get some of that right and improve the modelling, that we start making decisions now which are irrevocable, and we're locked into these decisions, and actually, because we didn't have the right information base to start with, we make decisions that are not good for the future and not good for Scotland. It's a very wide question, I know that, but well, I think whoever feels best to take this on, I think, Convener, because if we kind of get this right at the very beginning, I think we've got a hell of a task later.
Alan?
I mean, if I was to try and bottom out on this, I would add one other very large dimension to the model, which I think we don't have just now, which is, I think, the state of the Scottish, UK, European economy over the next 2 to 3 decades. Because there is an implicit assumption around that if we hold our breath in 5 years, things will get better. Whereas the modelling evidence we have on other economies with this level of debt overhang of 90% for 5 years or more, there's 26 instances of that over the last 200 years. And the level of the recession that sets in place is on average 21 years. With a decrease in the rate of growth of, on average, 1.2%. Now, the cumulative effect of 1.2% over 23 years is exception. And I think we've got to think much more about building that into our model instead of the kind of wish fulfillment that we will wish we were somewhere else.
Yes, mine's at a more sort of basic level than Alan's. I absolutely agree that the modelling is key to some of this, but the data to underpin that modelling isn't really good enough. So if we're in a situation where we're not even sure of the costs of delivering particular things, it's quite difficult to see longer term what those changes might entail. But I think there's enough intelligence and knowledge within Scotland to be able to actually start looking at quite radical changes, and very taken by Mr. McMahon's point about attachment to buildings as ways of delivering services, because it's quite clear for the health service that actually some services are much better delivered in larger regional centres in terms of quality of care and outcomes. But we don't really have that debate on a national scale. But once you start opening that up, you could start looking at, if we're doing this, what would that release in terms of funding for services that we are getting evaluative evidence that actually does work in the longer term. So I suppose basically my argument would be that we do need to improve the quality of the information we have to do some of that modelling, but actually that's where real benefits could come for the longer term planning.
Comment as well on this?
Just to say a few things about modelling, and especially modelling the future population of Scotland. The NRS, National Records of Scotland, provide population models, and these are always based on assumptions, and these are really best guesses at the time. And it's interesting to see how the assumptions change from year to year. But they also provide a range of projections, so that we have an idea of what might happen under different scenarios. Now, I know that people planning services and so on, like some firm figures. But I think it's probably a good idea to think in terms of more flexible, that these are the range of things that might happen in the future if you want to know, particularly about 25 years down the line. I think I'm not a great fan of projections any further than 25 years, because I just don't think we know what's going to happen. But I think the migration is the big thing, that we don't have good migration data, and therefore we really are making guesses about what might happen in the future. And just as an example, one of the migration streams into Scotland has been from those countries, accession countries, newly joined the EU. But we really don't have much information on this. We know it's happening, but we don't know how many people are going back, how many people are living partly in Poland, let's say, partly in Scotland. We don't pick up that in the migration data, so it's very difficult to project the future. Having said that, we've also had not only an increase in population through migration, but an increase in fertility recently. And I've heard it said that one way that Scotland might cope in the future is that it might save by closing schools and put that money elsewhere into the older population. But actually, the best guess is that we'll need the schools. The under-16s are going to rise in number slowly before they have a slight fall off in about 10 years' time. That's the best guess. So I don't think we should be thinking about saving on the school end or the young people end in order to invest in the increasing elderly.
I think everybody has made an important contribution that I'll not duplicate. I think there is a question of modelling how and why particular demographic patterns, whatever they emerge to be, convert into demand in public services. Because the vast majority of older people do not use public services associated with their age. There is a very distinct deprivation effect runs through all the data that we need to take very seriously in terms of targeting prevention with respect to older age. So I think there's a bit for me, and it may be about 5 to 10 year projections, Bruce, rather than 50. What is the conversion factors going on here? Why are they going on? And if you wanted to alter things, how would you challenge and intervene in those conversion factors? I've suggested in the paper, I submitted, some are about entitlements. So what converts demography into demand is you have the right, if you fall into a certain age category, to get something. My organisation manages all of the distribution of concessionary travel scheme cards for older people, younger people and so on across Scotland. That's 2.4 million as it stands just now. To anybody over 60 is entitled to a travel concession. Clearly there's almost an automatic conversion there. We know with care it's much more complicated. The vast majority of older people are not making any significant demands on health or care services until the very last period of their lives, typically kind of 18 months to 2 years. So I think we need to get a much better hook, modelling-wise, and in planning public services and public spending on what are these patterns of conversion. Can we change some of them positively by challenging deprivation in old age and so on? And indeed, how much is what happens in Scotland subject to decisions that will be made by, in the short term at least, UK governments, whatever the outcome of the constitutional question is, that because there is a distinct issue about how welfare reform will impact across all of this in terms of the insecurity that will generate for people. So I think we're struggling to model long-term economic trends accurately. We're struggling, as Elspeth has said, to model long-term demographic trends, and we're also struggling just now to work out how the one converts into the other and into demand in public services.
If migration is one of these big issues that we need to deal with in terms of having the raw data even, what needs to happen to allow us to get access to that information, to put us in a situation to actually make that modelling better?
Well, the information is really not collected at the moment. That's one of the problems. There is no border between Scotland and England at this moment that allows you to monitor movement. The way that migration is monitored is through re-registration with the health services and through the International Passenger Survey, which is a very small sample, and the people coming into Scotland are an even smaller sample. So we have very inaccurate data, I would say, about that. We do have reasonable data on students simply because the universities provide it. But I really don't know what you do about that.
We'll put it another way. How good is the data about people even coming into the UK in terms of what we know what's happening there, and we can extrapolate something from that?
Yes, we can, although it's usually extrapolated, as I said, from small sample surveys. So, but I would like to, if I may, pick up a point about the connection between the demographics and the demand for care, because one of the developments at the moment being headed by David Bell in Stirling, Professor David Bell, he is trying to set up a survey, a data collection survey on ageing population. So it unfortunately has the name of Haggis, but it's healthy ageing in Scotland. But the other countries have set this up. England has ELSA, which is the English Longitudinal Study of Ageing, and Ireland also has a longitudinal study of ageing. And what that does is tries to bring together data on the ageing population with a survey that monitors demand for different types of service. That's something Scotland doesn't have at the moment, and I think that would be very helpful in the future.
To new members of the committee and also the witnesses that we have actually in this committee raised the issue of data a number of occasions, and Professor Bell has. In fact, we've also taken evidence from Scottish Government officials on that particular issue, and it's something I think we will continue to return to because I think it is a very important issue. Gavin, to be followed by John.
Thank you. First question directed to Alan Sinclair. The convener's opening question to you was about Nairn, North Lanarkshire, the borders, and Holland, and you talked about how services had been reconfigured, and you gave the specific example of a risk register, I think, for every elderly person in Nairn. For any of those, do we have any evidence at this stage of the success or results for any of those four? Are you able to expand on that?
I know in the instance on Nairn, they do collect their figures as part of the subset for the Regmore Hospital area around Inverness. And the people of Nairn, the group of doctors there, are very convinced, and they've gone through some of the figures with me, that they can see the improved trends of people dying at home and being looked after in the community rather than being admitted. So those figures are there, and you might be interested in getting someone from there, the head of the practice, to come and speak to you and to go through that. Some of these other examples are not, sorry, the North Lanarkshire I don't think is as long down the line, so the evidence isn't there. And in Holland, that's a different kettle of fish.
Helpful, thank you. Second question, it's open to anyone. I suppose initially directed though at Barbara Hurst. Again, somebody else referred to this, but in your written submission, you talked about a lack of good performance information across the public sector, particularly related to cost, activity and quality, and a number of members have picked up on that. And again, I think you said in your last verbal submission there's a need to improve the quality of the information. Within the realms of this inquiry, obviously we will have to write a conclusion at the end of it, and I'm fairly sure we'll conclude along the lines that there's a lack of good performance information. And again, Mr. Crawford touched on that. Can we be more specific than that at this stage? I mean, with your Director of Performance Audit hat on, what are the priorities in terms of getting better data, and what are the sort of things this committee could suggest as a matter of urgency when we report, so that actually something happens, so that we're not, 5 years down the track saying again, oh, there's a lack of good performance data. there are probably dozens of areas where things could be better, but what in your view, and other panel members' views, are the absolute priorities that we ought to be focusing on?
With my Director of Performance Audit hat on, I think there's legitimately a real focus on outcomes for people, because that's why we're all doing the jobs we're doing, because we want improved outcomes for people in Scotland. But I think that can't just be the sole focus, because you need to understand for a particular outcome, what is it that actually you have to spend and what do you have to do to achieve that? So it's not enough just to focus on one end of that equation. And we, in all of our work, we do struggle to get really robust data on actually, and you wouldn't think it, you know, it's, but it is the case, actually how much are you spending to deliver that service, and how do you know that's the best use of that money? So it sounds very basic, and it's pure value for money type questions, but I think we need better data. We really do need to understand actually what is being spent. You wouldn't think it would be that hard, but it proves to be. What are you doing, and what evidence do you have that that works better than something else? And then, longer term, is that leading to better outcomes? So I think it's not an easy thing just to say one of those, but particularly in light of the current financial situation, it may be that without that information, we're not going to know what other ways we can provide services, because we're locked into this doom and gloom. But actually, if we start having much better evidence of what works for a given price, I think it may start unlocking some of it. But it does need some quite radical thinking about different ways of providing services, I think. That we can't continue with people providing services in their individual silos without bringing the costs of all of that together, because we're not going to break through this cycle, I don't think. So sorry, that's not probably a very helpful answer to the committee, but it's one that sort of permeates all of our work at the moment.
I think just 2 points, because I think the question is a very good one. We struggle, I think, around what success means in outcome terms some of the time. And in a way, there seems to be 2 levels of evaluation you can do in Scotland now. You can do very detailed evaluations of a particular programme or service, and you can do it at local level, and you can see what that tells you. And often that local level is easiest from a cost attribution point of view, because it's happening in a given place. You can look at all the input costs, the outputs and the outcomes. Quite often, if you look at these evaluation reports, they suggest success. In other words, the outcomes we sought to achieve are being reasonably cost effectively achieved. If you go above that level and almost say, well, okay, then we'd expect spatial trends in this area to be different than they were, and different from other areas with the same characteristics. When you do that level of analysis, say using Scottish neighbourhood statistics across the whole of Scotland, you almost always find there's no impact on trend whatsoever. So one of our issues is what does working mean here? If people are reporting success evaluating an individual service, but then when you go looking, well, are the outcomes then different if you map this over time? And they aren't, and that's the uniform outcome of such studies, then there is a real dilemma for us, because it's not that MD's being dishonest in the former type of evaluation. It merely appears to yield a totally different result than the other. So I think for members of Parliament, there may be a question, what is it you're asking for? I mean, are you saying we want to see fundamental trends in Scotland shifted, so there's more equal and more positive outcomes across the board, and here's the timescale we want to see it go do, in which case we'll report back to you on the latter basis? Or is it, let's keep on testing out project by project by project? But I'd take Barbara's point, we're running out of time for piloting things here. We are now getting to where we need to be deciding fundamentally how do we go forward. So I think there is a dilemma about that. Cost attribution is also difficult. I mean, one of the best studies of reducing emergency admissions to hospital, done by the King's Fund of the Midlands Strategic Health Authorities down south, What it showed was you can do it, and you can do it quite quickly. You were talking about 40% reductions in admissions of older people to hospital on an emergency basis across a 3-year period, but it actually costs more than admitting them to hospital. So it depends what you imagine you're trying to do here. Are you trying to save money, or are you trying to improve outcomes? And I think Barbara's point is we need to get both of those things together. We are going to have to look at how we get the best outcomes we can get out of the resources we are likely to have available.
Can I just come back on this? And it's, we often try and develop case studies of good practice to demonstrate particular things. And there are two things going on. One, a not invented here syndrome. So I appreciate that local areas are different, but sometimes the evidence has been overwhelming that there are particularly good ways of doing things, but they don't get picked up because they haven't been, you know, developed in a local area. And the second one, and it's just to reinforce what Colin's saying, that actually we do have a lot of pilots, and you might have an injection of money, so you'll set up a pilot, but there's very little mainstreaming. So there needs to be much better evaluation, and if it works, then mainstream, if you can, you know, because we're just doing some work on health inequalities, and there's some really good work going on in Glasgow around addressing health inequalities through particular GP practices. But it's, you know, at the moment it's just Glasgow. If this is working there, surely it can be replicated elsewhere.
I think it's worth pointing out that the 2011 census is going to give us lots of opportunity to look at the macro outcomes in terms of long-term illness, in terms of mortality or premature mortality. So we will be able to do that. But overwhelmingly, if you look at the health inequalities at the macro level, deprivation comes out as the main factor. In just about any unemployment, any sort of outcome you're looking at that level. But the 2011 census will also give us another opportunity, and that is to see in a much more detailed way how much unpaid care is being provided in Scotland and by whom and to whom. So it seems to me that this will be an opportunity to have a more detailed look, albeit a cross-sectional look, at what's going on in terms of health inequalities and unpaid care.
John, to be followed by Elaine.
Okay, thank you. My first point, I think, was based on your paper, Alan Sinclair's paper, and in paragraph 9, you talk about some of the things that people would like to see, which include control over their lives, being independent in their own homes, being respected, treated fairly, having decent neighbours, and so on. I mean, is that are people realistic in what they're expecting for their old age?
What I was trying to show was actually it's very mundane, everyday things that people want as they grow older. And most of those things are non-clinical. And yet we look at old people as a clinical issue, whereas it's not. It's just an everyday part of life and getting older and dying. And we need to start thinking about it in that context rather than like the joiner who only has one tool, a hammer, and everything is a nail. We keep on thinking that ageing is a clinical issue.
And I'm thinking that in with the point that we're not very good at dying that Colin made earlier on. Are we also not very good at thinking realistically, what is my life going to be between 65 and, say, 80 or whatever?
I think we have a clash between the types of services that we provide and what people actually want. It's interesting, there are very, very few studies on this, and the one that I could find on it actually ended up that what the services were measuring was the number of visits that they made according to what had been commissioned, whereas what the old people wanted was somebody to talk to them. And that was how they judged it being a good service. And we have such a clash of cultures on this. And I think this is part of it. If we are going back to the basics and getting the fundamentals right of our model, some of this has to come back to to make this a very human issue and understand it in those terms, rather than just think that this is something that is in that public services that we will deliver year in, year out as a public service, rather than thinking it's a public service to help people have a decent life.
So just to perhaps reinforce the point Alan's made, if you look at the large-scale statistical data sets, and this is quite easy to do, the people who are most likely to make high demands on health and social care services in their old age are people who will not enjoy the things you just read out, John. The people who make least demand on health and care services in old age are the people who will enjoy the things you just read out. So I'm sitting here thinking, well, I'll probably retire in 3-4 years' time. I expect all of those things, and I will make sure I get them. But that'll be because I will start out very advantaged into my old age with a decent pension, savings, and all the rest of it, and I will orchestrate those to have the life I want. It's also unlikely I will make the same pattern of demand in health and care services as someone who is living in an area of deprivation and a very low income. So I think when we think about prevention, it's not a preventative health service we want or a preventative care service. What appears to prevent is people live better, live less stressful lives, live in better housing, and so on. If all of that's the case, they then do make less demand on expensive public services.
That you've kind of touched on the word that I was going to come to next, which is pensions, because we haven't really mentioned that so far. And I mean, I just see a whole lot of tensions in here because we've got the public sector, which I don't think provides a great pension, but reasonable. We've got the private sector generally providing pretty awful. So somehow we need to, I would have thought, or it seems we need to kind of pull up the private sector pension, both employees and employers. However, saving, you can say, well, saving is a good thing. That's a preventative measure for the long term. But, it's not really encouraged by interest rates at the moment, so that's a disadvantage, and the Chancellor wants people to spend, not to save. Also, it ties in with the whole concept of if services are not going to be universal when people are older, it does discourage them from saving. Because I get so many people say to me, well, why should I have bothered saving? Because I'm now going to have to pay for this. And if they think they have to pay for their bus pass, will that discourage people from actually saving? And I'm struggling to get my head around that area. I don't know if anyone can help me.
I think if you look at the pattern just now, John, a lot of public attitude surveys do raise the issue you raise. Why should I save all my life and then someone else gets what I will now pay for free of charge? On the other hand, that does seem to correlate to levels of income. So if you're just above a deprivation level of income, you're more likely to say that than you're earning £50,000–60,000 a year, in which case you will be saving and you don't think about it that way at all. And frankly, a bus pass is almost irrelevant to you. So I think it's deciding at what point you start to have disincentive effects and actually having evidence to measure at what point you're having a disincentive effect. It's also, I think, true around pensions that we are going to, as part of a general movement at UK level, almost certainly alter pension arrangements in the public sector in Scotland. People will pay more across their working life and get lower average pensions in their older age because it will be across your working life rather than final salary type scheme. So there will be an alteration, I think, quite substantially to public sector pension entitlements. And I think one of the issues for parliamentarians will be if there appears to be a generation that just happened to hit it seriously lucky across the whole of its lives here. It never paid tuition fees or anything like it when they were students. They got grants, and so on. I include myself in this, who then had a basic state pension, a state earnings-related pension, good occupational pensions. There may be some resentment amongst younger people about paying so that those people can have free services in their old age, even though their incomes are actually higher than the younger people who are paying the tax to pay for the services. So I think there's an intergenerational equity thing here, whichever way you go, that will need thought through politically to maintain the solidarity that Michael alluded to earlier on, because we're in some danger, I think, of getting an intergenerational breakdown of solidarity. Some people seem to be doing very well. If, as you say, economic growth happens, that's very bad news in data we've just commissioned from the private sector, because we have about 20% of households in Scotland. The moment growth happens and interest rates go up, they're in real trouble. The only thing that's holding their household finances together just now is interest rates are at a staggeringly low level by historical standards. A 1 or 2% increase in interest rates, they're gone. So we have very vulnerable younger populations, financially speaking, as economic growth kicks in, and a growing demand from an older population for services. And I think that's what you'll be balancing as parliamentarians, and that will be the policy challenge. How do you make fair judgments intergenerationally across that?
Can I take a practical consequence of that, which is that I think this intergenerational equity, as well as health equity and deprivation, we do have to, I think, seriously consider what Dilnot proposed in England on care, which is some form of insurance system for people who have net worth over a certain threshold, and that they will contribute to this so that that will pay for their care if it's required at a certain level. I must say it's the only practical measure that I can see is in any sense realistic. And initially it was kicked into the long grass by the Chancellor in England because he didn't want to think of something like that. More recently, they began to reconsider it again. I think it's something that we should be thinking at in Scotland, because I'm not quite sure how the legislation would work on that, but it would have an awful lot of equity to it.
Pressure on that point on Dilnot. If I understand it correctly, I mean, at the moment in Scotland, if somebody's in a care home or something, then they have to keep using up their savings until it gets to a kind of minimal level, and they're allowed to keep that. But under Dilnot, you would actually only pay up to 35,000, and then after that, you wouldn't pay?
My understanding from this is that it varies across Scotland at the moment. So, you know, if you have a mother who's got dementia, and some families are meeting that from their own purse. And other local authority areas, that is being met for them.
Propose that after a ceiling, whether you're medium rich or very rich, you wouldn't pay any more?
That's right. There would be a cap on it. But you would be an insurance to up to a certain point for those that could afford it.
The personal care and the social care bit, though, because Parliament has legislated in Scotland that the personal care would be free irrespective of income. It's the social care element and accommodation element you'd pay for out of savings, or your family would pay for on your behalf. Down south at the present moment, the personal care element is charged the same way as the social care element is charged. So we are distinct in the UK, and I think distinct in Europe actually, with respect to our policy on personal care at the present moment.
The social care element then, in fact, the English charging, the Scottish charging is currently more aggressive than what Dilnot is proposing.
It is. English charging is currently more aggressive than what Dilnot's proposing, and one of the issues for the Chancellor clearly is, if you cap this, are you taking income out of the system as demand grows within the system, and how will you balance that off?
Have I got time for one more?
One more.
Okay, thanks. Back to Alan Sinclair. Your point about the 23 years is historically what it's taken people to get out of or countries to get out of heavy debt. But you suggest that that's without the heavy levels of personal debt that we've got. So are you actually suggesting it could be worse than that?
This is Reinhardt and Gold, who are the big economists on this area, and they've been trying to, we've talked about modelling quite a lot this morning. And their health warning at the bottom of their article on when they have modelled this is that there are three things that are different from this level of indebtedness, which is beyond the 5 years, which is shared across so many of the advanced economies, is that normally state debt is with its own inhabitants, the creditors live in the country, whereas now a lot of that is internationalised. And that makes it harder to shift that debt because you can't turn to the tool of inflation to punish the creditors. So that's the difference. The second one is that what we've just been talking about, pensions and demography, are against us at this moment in time as well. And the third one is that in the other instances that they've recorded, the 23, 26 instances when you've had this debt overhang for 5 years or more, there hasn't been the same level of personal debt, just state debt. So they put a real health warning.
Okay, thank you. And it's Elaine to be followed by Jean.
Thank you, Convener. It sort of follows on a bit from what you were talking about, because obviously universal services like free personal care are only really a financial problem when they're being claimed. No, a lot of people aren't claiming them. And Colin made reference to families and communities being able to assist, but, you know, with the people having children later in life and being required to work until they're 66 up to 68. My parents will be 95 and 91 by the time I receive my state pension, so I'm not going to be a lot of use to them, really. I wondered actually about an alternative model where older people are involved in the design and delivery of services from themselves. I actually have a very good example of that in the food trade in my own constituency. And if people are able to access, to a certain extent, the personal care, it's too late. You know, so if somebody lives in a house and they can't do the heavy housework or the heavy gardening any longer, you know, they may endanger themselves by trying to do things for which they are not capable. And also things like that are going to have a significant effect on people's mental health when they're living in a way which they feel is inappropriate. So are there international examples, other examples we can learn from where there are, through social enterprises, examples of how older people can become, and their communities can become involved in the design of the services they need in order to prevent them from needing these higher level services later on?
Great examples, I think, throughout the voluntary and social enterprise sector. There's a whole range of, I mean, sometimes they're actually branded this way, but instant neighbour schemes, that you will do something for an older person in your area that any neighbour would do, but you can summon up. Some of them have imaginatively used offenders coming out of prison to create jobs through social enterprises for them as they get back into society. And that would mean exactly the point you raise, I think, that the blow to pride and esteem of a garden you've kept in pristine condition most of your life now starts to deteriorate, become overgrown, look disgusting and so on. And that really bothers people. It does affect their mental well-being, that it always visually expresses their decline for themselves and to their neighbours. So I think there is a host of such examples, and the interesting thing is they're often low cost, light touch, and so on. And it does pick up on Alan's point, an awful lot of what is valued is the contact that generates. I've mentioned, I think, to Kenny before, but when I was evaluating some joint future schemes where there was a single assessment rather than multiple assessments of older people with public agencies, one old lady said to us up a Glen in Perthshire that, yeah, it was much slicker and all that, but she really missed all the young people who used to come out of her house to assess it, and she didn't mind multiple assessment because it was contact. Now, it's quite expensive way of getting contact for older people, but and I think that bit, as well as the practical doing of quite simple things, change light bulbs, put up curtains for somebody who wants to change their curtains or take them down so they can be washed, etc. These are things we can organise for ourselves as communities, and yet we can show over time, where these things have been well in place, the pattern of demand on the more intensive public services and the clinical services is actually reduced. So there's a bit about community capacity here and willingness that has to go alongside public service effort to get, I agree with you, to the better balance that you're talking about. There's quite a lot pulled together by way of just evidence about social enterprises. If you'd like, I can send it through.
Whether, you know, obviously, you know, social enterprises or community enterprises, they come from the community. It's not really a matter for central government coming, clunking in and telling people how to do things or they should be doing them. But it's ways in which, I suppose, that government at local level, at national level, can actually facilitate
national government is and local government is, because an awful lot of what you need for those schemes is coordination. You need to have a full-time person who can get all of this together, take in what people need and patch it up with what other people are willing to offer. And I think that enablement function is actually very important, and that we don't make small cuts that take that out and then lose whole voluntary services as a consequence of making very small cuts that save very little money. So I think we need a lot of care across the next period that bit is protected as part of how we go forward.
Jean?
Well, I mean, I think my observations really follow on very well from Elaine and from what Colin Mayer has said, and that is really to think about it in a completely different way. And I think there are people doing that. And I think that this committee needs to hear from some of them, because there are extraordinarily good examples and pieces of research that are done from universities. And what I don't know is where do they end up? Are they just gathering dust on a shelf? Because we probably in every community have examples of something that worked. And I was interested when I think it was you again, Colin, who said that It's when you take a service away that unites a community. Well, when you take a lunch club away from folk in their 70s and 80s, they're united. But the outcome in my community was, instead of, I think, about 17 people getting their dinner twice a week or something like that, we suddenly had 87 people because they did it themselves. And they're not the local authorities, so they're not assessing each other. They just know that people want to come out and they want to talk. Now, there's ways of doing this, and it seems to me that it's the positives we need to concentrate on. I think it was Barbara who said that keeping people at home at all costs, because that's what we've said, and actually that's what people themselves say, and I think that's probably what everybody would like, not to be institutionalised or hospitalised in their old age. But you did say that some of the preventative spend was being reduced. It just wasn't available because we were at all costs. And there's a question for me about who decides, but also nobody has talked about preventative spend and how that's working or not working, because the preventative stuff actually has to come to the fore here. For me, the stats about how many old people we're going to have and so on don't excite me, I have to say. And often I don't believe them. And I do think that there are things that we are doing, like introducing a culture where people have to drink less and smoke less, and that's happening. It is happening. People are getting healthy. Younger people are seeing things differently. And I'm just going to finish with a couple of wee examples of an 8-year-old boy who arrived late for school, and the teacher said to him, "Why are you late?" And he said, "Because I was teaching my great-granny to work her iPhone." And that sparked a number of groups of people up and down Northwest Sutherland. I mean, these are rural communities of 8-year-olds teaching 80-year-olds how to work their iPhones. And, there's the fact is that we don't actually all want to talk to 80-year-olds. And just one other example of things that we should be doing, I think, and that is a long time ago, about 15, 20 years ago, I had a group of folk from Burkina Faso visiting Scotland, and they were in the Highlands, and we were on a wee tour in a minibus with about 12 people, and we passed in the area that we travelled, we passed two. They were asking what everything was as we went along the road. What's that? What's that? And they asked about this building that we had in Gairloch, and I said it's an old folks' home, because I still think of them like that, or care home. And they went into great babble in their own language, which I couldn't understand, and the translator came back to say they don't what is this? And so I explained what it was, and that went back to a great babble again, and they came back and said, but that's extraordinary. If the old people are there, how do the young people learn? Now, the wee computer thing, the wee iPhone teaching thing is just an anecdote, but, we can do that. We can do this. And it seems to me that we can, we can look at alternatives and positives about getting older. We talk about older people as a resource, and then we talk about it, but we don't actually give people that sense. And there are young people doing old folks' gardens. That's happening. There's allotments where people are growing vegetables and giving them to old people. Can we hear about some of these examples across Scotland? Sorry.
We have to let the witnesses comment, and the questions should really be much more succinct, I think, than that, because we have to allow witnesses to answer, and we have to keep within the time that we actually have. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to those comments. Barbara?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely agree. I agree with Colin that actually there are loads of examples of great community initiatives, but the issue around the preventative side versus the financial pressures around the more intense needs, if you like, means that some of those services are at risk. And I don't know if you have any voluntary sector people coming to talk to you, but certainly what we're hearing relentlessly, actually, is that they're being squeezed in the current climate. Nevertheless, I absolutely agree with you. There are some great initiatives going on, and I just think of circles of care where people are doing quite different things than you would expect, like getting together to go to art galleries or whatever, because that's what they want to do with a little bit of support. So things like that are great. The technology, I think, in terms of the positives and thinking forward, we have to remember that all those technological advances are things that can be put to good use here. So, you know, people will be used, of our generation and younger, of using apps for different things. So if you're really trying to get people engaged in their own healthcare, what a brilliant way of doing it if people are comfortable using that sort of format. And there are some very good examples of people just being phoned up to be told that the weather's changing. If they've got emphysema or asthma or something, the weather's changing, they need to be a bit careful with the heating or whatever. So there are some great, really great examples, and I do agree with you that actually getting out of the mindset that this is all a problem is quite important. And actually getting into the mindset that actually we need to make use of everything that we can. I guess the one area we haven't touched on, and I'm about to bring us back into the doom and gloom, is the dementia issue, which I think is something that with a growing older population is inevitable. But again, telecare services can keep people at home safely for longer than would have been the case in the past. So it's issues like that that actually maybe we can use more creatively.
I mean, I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what Jean just said, and I think actually the economic role of older people is not unimportant with respect to childcare and a whole variety of other things. So that it's quite right to say there is a balance sheet here, not just one dimension, and that looking at how older people can and do contribute is an important part of a preventative strategy, in my view, that they remain active, engaged, and being rewarded by contact with a much broader range of people. I mean, a parallel anecdote, I took a group of very senior Indian civil servants around Scotland. One of the things we looked at was a brilliant place run by the Church of Scotland for dementia, beautifully designed place and so on. And they said to me afterwards, "Why do you hate your older people?" And I said, "Sorry, what do you mean?" Because I thought they'd be impressed with it. He said, "Well, what sort of society dumps all of its older people into places designed for older people? Why aren't they living with you? Why aren't they out there?" And so on. And you can see a whole lot of things, obviously, in response to that, about our patterns of family, work, etc., and how they've changed over time. But it is true that some of our most expensive ways of addressing the needs of older people are also the ones that to older people themselves and to anybody looking from outside seem the oddest ways in which you would deal with people you cared about and valued. And we do need to think as we go forward about that valuation principle and how we build that through our forward strategies.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Elspeth, you wanted to comment as well?
Just very briefly, I just wanted to comment on the intergenerational exchanges, because I think they're really important in any society. And as we've heard, older people tend to provide all sorts of care for grandchildren or whatever. And I think, therefore, it's probably very important to tackle issues of intergenerational justice, but also misperceptions between the generations. I think it would be very damaging to set up a distinction that younger people are suffering because older people have been so successful. Younger people are suffering because the economy is not doing so well. And I think that's one of the things that has to be recognised. But I think in certain parts of the press, we do have these intergenerational wars and so on. I think that's a very damaging notion.
That is exhausting the questions from the committee. I'm just wondering if each of our witnesses maybe has a final point they would like to put to the committee before we wind up this session. Colin?
Welcome a view on the short to medium term as well as the long term in the committee's deliberations as it goes forward. I think we are very well focused actually just now in Scotland on the longer term, and often politicians are accused of being totally short term and unwilling to think long term. I think in Scotland just now we're thinking largely long term. The question is, how do we get through the next 5 to 10 years? And we really do have to honestly address that, or it will become a guddle and a shambles as we just bounce off difficulties as we encounter them. So I very much welcome the fact the committee is doing this inquiry, but I would welcome, yes, a long-term view, but frankly, how do we transact the short to medium term, I think, is of critical importance to moving forward. Elizabeth?
Yes, I think I would just like to say very briefly that there are obviously challenges ahead from ageing, but emphasise again that these challenges after the next 5-10 years are not clear. Things could change, the picture could change quite quickly, and that they vary very much across Scotland.
Thank you. Alan?
I would just ask us to try and have a more realistic economic model as we go forward on this. And also to try and use, I find this divide in people I deal with in talking this subject of the professional brain being one place and the personal brain in the other. And I would recommend to the committee to actually approach this in a human way, as well as a politician, about the ageing process and about a life worth living in an economic context that's going to become very difficult.
Last word. I really welcome the committee's inquiry. I think it's incredibly timely. And if there's anything the committee can do to encourage and support the breakdown of some of the silos in the way in which we provide services, that would be the biggest thing, biggest prize, I think, both in terms of the budgets, but also in the way that services are delivered.
Very much. That was very helpful, and is indeed were all the contributions from the witnesses today. I'm sure it will help inform the roundtable session, which will follow on from this session. It now just leaves me to. We need some time, obviously, to set up for the round table, and members will need a natural break as well. So we will reconvene at 11:38. Okay, folks, I shall now reconvene the session and we turn now to our second group of witnesses. Given the number of witnesses that we have today, we'll take evidence in a round table format. So, can I welcome to the meeting Anne Simpson of the National Osteoporosis Society, Delia Henry, Action on Hearing Loss Scotland, Lord Sutherland of Houndwood, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, Professor Robert Logie, Centre for Cognitive Ageing and Cognitive Epidemiology, Robert Parry, NHS Education for Scotland, and Simon Fevre, I hope I'm pronouncing that, Fever, of the British Diabetic Association. Our previous, sorry?
Diabetic Association.
Oh, sorry, apologies, it is dietetic. I didn't know that, actually, sorry. The problem is I can't read with glasses on, and I do try, right? So sorry, Simon Fever of the British Dietetic Association. Our previous discussion discussed the impact of demography and the ageing population across the three subject areas our inquiry is considering. And I'd like this session to focus on health and social care, and I'll again allow up to 90 minutes for the discussion. Now, it being a round table situation, it's less formal. In the previous session, I tend to open with questions, and it's open to the committee, and witnesses can answer in turn. But here, what will happen is I will be asking Lord Sutherland to kick off. I will make a comment or two, and then I'll ask Lord Sutherland to kick off. And then anyone who wishes to ask a question or make a point can do so. And there's no restriction on the number of questions or interventions people can have. It's simply a question of catching my eye, and Jim will write down everybody's names, and people will be allowed to come in sequence, frankly. If there's something specifically, though, that you wish to comment on immediately after someone else has spoken, you know, you may be able to come in as a supplementary. So it's a wee bit of suck it and see. So to start us off, just to set the tone and allow people's cognitive juices to start flowing, I just want to comment on a quote of paragraph 8 from Lord Sutherland's submission, which states, fiscal sustainability is influenced by the extent to which, as a country, we embed healthy ageing and preventative interventions into our current and future priorities. Lord Sutherland's submission then goes on to say, it is important that preventative measures are aimed not merely at avoiding death, but also at reducing morbidity, enhancing quality of life, increasing people's contribution to society, and reducing their demand on services. And the economy as a whole will benefit from the adoption of this approach. And I'm just wondering, Lord Sutherland, if you can expand on that comment.
Right, thank you very much. And just to be plain, this is the Royal Society of Edinburgh paper. I'm very happy to speak to it because I have a great admiration for it. But a lot of people were involved in putting it together, a lot of work involved. But on that particular paragraph, I'm glad that's one you've picked out, because it's easy to be doom and gloom in all of this. And the fact that demography is changing in every advanced country, and indeed even in those that are still developing their economies. It's not a UK or even a Western thing only. It's across the board. So it's a common issue. And one of the points that we certainly have to focus on, and I don't know how far your committee can push other people in this direction, but if you can, that would be great, is value for money, effectiveness of spend. And the effectiveness of spend relates to how far the money being spent is looking beyond an immediate problem, and these are real, very real, to saying, well, 5 years' time, 10 years' time, if we spend money this way, will the community be healthier? And if you want to make it financial, will we be spending our money in the best way? Because we all know it's at the end of life, and I don't mean the last few days, but the last a few years, where you, as a pensioner, you make greater claims on the health service and indeed on social care. Now, if there's any way to reduce that, and it's not the same for everybody, then let's focus on it. And that was the point of this particular paragraph. Healthy aging, it has to do everything from the biomolecular right through. I mean, are you taking your statins, for example? That's a real issue, and there's a big debate about whether everybody over 50 should take statins, and it might. I mean, I'm not a scientist, I don't know the outcome, but that's an important question to ask and to answer, because spend on that, which is much cheaper than some of the drugs that people might need later on. Spend on that, that's well spent, good. Spend on the, and I mean, I'm not going to mount a defence of free bus passes, though I do benefit from that occasionally. But actually, it's made an all or nothing. I'll just give you a suggestion. Suppose you said it's important for folks to get out of their house, and there are many old people who find that difficult. And without the option of taking the bus into town or the supermarket to get their shopping, life would be much harder. So you have a bus pass that's limited to 20 journeys a week or 20 journeys a month or whatever it is. It doesn't have to be all or nothing, and it could be means tested. I mean, I'm not raising that issue. But that use of money might have a very positive effect on healthy ageing. And actually, the health is of the mind as well as of the body. So what's the quality of life that people have access to? Now, I could begin to drift towards transport, housing, a whole range of things. The stimulus that people can get, you were in this in your last session, as they master the web. And, you know, that's something that's a generational thing. The generations after some of us will be used to getting the stimulus in their own house from this little screen in the corner, or big screen as a kid. So how do you focus the spend on that? And you can only do that by decent evaluation and value for money. And Audit Scotland's had quite a bit to say about this. So I think I'll stop at that, but it's effective use of money and getting value for money in the medium to long term, as well as the need that you have right in front of you now. Michael.
Yeah, thanks, Convener. Lord Sutherland has done something which neatly connects to the last session that we had when Colin Mayer was asking us to look at the short to medium term as well as projecting as far as we can into the future. And he gave us a few ideas, and we heard some of those ideas when we looked at our sustainable spending inquiry, because we're not reinventing the wheel. Essentially, a lot of the ideas are out there, and a lot of what people expect and know has to be decided on in the near future. We already know that where those areas are and where some of the ideas are. But when Colin Mayer was speaking earlier and he asked us to consider short to medium term looks at how we deliver health and social care, it reminded me of the fact that we already have a report which did that. The CARE report looked at that very issue. So are we just going to go back and revisit CARE? Or do we take the CARE blueprint and take it forward and start implementing it? Because it appears to me that in some areas it's been implemented, but in my own area in Lanarkshire, it's lying in tatters on the floor. So we already know that the work has been done to indicate, you know, some of the thinking on how we deal with things short term and in longer term, moving from acute services to preventative spending, primary care services getting a priority. But it's the implementation of those plans that's the real challenge. You know, the ideas are already there. It's how do we get from taking those blueprints and actually implementing them, because that takes political will, but it also takes expertise to argue the case.
Can I just come back on that, because I've just come from a conference in the Dynamic Earth discussing precisely some of these issues, which is why I couldn't be in the earlier session. But one of the fundamental things there is integrating budgets. I have no doubt about that. If you can find a way to integrate health and social care budgets, and that depends, local initiatives, leadership, depends in the end on the pilot studies that I think the current government have sponsored, in fact.
I have many talents, but telepathy isn't one of them, so if people want to come in, please let me know. Robert, to be followed by Elaine.
NHS Education for Scotland is the national education and workforce providing a service to all professionals within the health service. We work in partnership with many public sector organisations. I do see the future of sustainability. If you look at the Christie Commission, actually identified public reform about organisations coming together, and we have a number of work streams already in place between ourselves and Scottish Social Services Council, for instance, looking at the health and social care issue for professionals. If you think the biggest resource that we've got is the staff that we employ, Scottish Social Services Council register around 198,000. If you look at the NHS, we have around 160,000 head count. So it's really a substantial amount of people that we really do need to engage in this debate. And certainly through partnership work across the public sector is one way forward that we could actually help support the agenda.
Lee?
The brief point I wanted to make really was when you're talking about the integration of health and social care is not to lose sight of the role of housing within that as well, because a lot of the housing associations will say that. There's a point made by Barbara Hurst in the last session as well, that people are living in inappropriate housing. They are much more likely to have accidents and be that much less able to do things for themselves and therefore suffer mental health problems. So I wonder whether there are issues about the inclusion of housing which have to be addressed when we look at the bill integrating social and healthcare.
Julia?
Yeah, you'll not surprisingly, I work in the voluntary sector, and I would suggest that, we heard in the last, some of the last evidence about relatively low-level interventions that can sustain people's independence. And we do work in collaboration and in partnership with the statutory sectors. For example, NHS Education Scotland, we've just done a whole series of work with pharmacists in the community so that we would highlight the issues around people's hearing loss and the implications on their lack of ability to take on health promotion messages and how we work in that. Now, it didn't cost that massive amount of money, but it's a different way of thinking, and I think if we can do what we're suggesting today, I think it could be particularly helpful. And back to the point we were making, when you talk to older people or people in general, they want to maintain their independence and stay in their own home. So all of the points together are absolutely critical, I think, that we do that. And I don't minimise the challenge of changing cultures and ways of thinking, but I think we have to do that or we're not going to be economically viable to deliver services in the future.
Professor Logie, you've raised some concerns about cognitive health. Can you elaborate?
Yes, I mean, my background is in looking at cognition across the lifespan, and clearly one of the issues that comes out of that sort of research, I'm a researcher rather than a practitioner, is that the different people age at different rates. And different aspects of their abilities change at different rates. That includes physical ability as well as cognitive abilities. And even among cognitive abilities, some deteriorate much faster than others. There are some cognitive abilities that start deteriorating in the early 20s, whereas other abilities are maintained quite well into old age. And then people who develop various kinds of neurodegenerative disorders, including Parkinson's disease, including Alzheimer's disease, and the various other kinds of dementias, that they have particular needs. So I think one of the messages is that not every old person is the same. There are different kinds of services that are needed for different sorts of people. And some of these are indirect. So a lot of the care for people with dementia, for example, is provided by relatives and friends, essentially for free to the state, except insofar as those people aren't contributing to the economy. But, for example, removing respite care support for those people could have a major impact because the carers themselves might need NHS treatment, as well as the people they're caring for have to then go into residential care, which is a major cost. So I think it's important to consider the differential needs there are for people with different kinds of challenges as they get older. That Alzheimer's dementia is not an inevitable aspect of ageing. It affects, I guess, about 1 in 4, according to the Alzheimer's Society, over the age of 80. But that means 3 out of 4 people are much less affected. But not everybody can be active, cognitive in old age, need help with their finances, need help with organising their grocery shopping and so on. And it's important to consider that there are subsections of society that might not benefit from provision for people who are generally active.
Gavin, to be followed by Bruce.
Julia Henry was speaking. I looked at the paper that was submitted in advance, and I think there were statistics in there that your organisation's prediction was that we'd go from 850,000 people in Scotland today with a degree of hearing loss to 1.2 million in 2031, and sight loss would go from about 180,000 to 400,000 by 2031. And I suppose you gave 2 factors of why you thought that would happen. One is the ageing process. The other is our more general health record. So while that's, I suppose, quite a specific point, I just wonder, to what extent do you think those figures are inevitable, and to what extent can we look at things that might be done to alter that?
Well, I mean, there is an inevitability, and there's a kind of correlation between an ageing population and sensory deterioration, and there is an inevitability of that. But what we would argue, both ourselves and RNIB, who we work very closely with, and that's why I'm here giving evidence on behalf of both of us today, is that if we pick this up as early as possible, so for example, we would argue as an organisation that we should screen people earlier, pick up their hearing loss, allow them, because we know people wait up to 10 years to have their hearing diagnosed, or their hearing loss diagnosed. And there is a kind of change you have to make to your lifestyle to become used to things like hearing aids, or be aware of other equipment that would help you in your home setting. And it can be fairly inexpensive to do that. But the earlier you pick people up, the more comfortable they are with the intervention, and the more comfortable they are in dealing with it. And there are correlations with other things. Robert and I were just talking earlier about that. So if you're more comfortable with your hearing loss or your visual impairment, ironically, people would say things like, well, I can't hear what you're saying because I haven't got my glasses on. You can't lip read. So it's getting those kind of interventions as early as possible, we would argue, could particularly help people's independence in the longer term.
I'll let you in on this point before I let Bruce in. Sorry, Robert Logie, sorry.
It's a follow-up, in fact, to that comment about the early assessment. I think also about informing people who are caring for individuals is really important. So, for example, there was a discussion towards the end of the previous session about science and research and so on, sitting gathering dust. I think Jean Urquhart made that possible point. It's really important that some of that science can get out there and inform carers. So understanding the nature of the cognitive problems from which a person suffers can be very helpful for somebody who's caring for that person. Whether they're caring from the home or caring from within a residential setting or in hospital, knowing what the person can and can't do is really important, rather than assuming that there's nothing they can do. Because there are some things that are affected rather more than others, for example, in case of dementia, but also in the case of healthy ageing. And so that the research can actually inform carers. A very practical example is that people with Alzheimer's disease have trouble doing two things at once. So don't get them to walk and talk at the same time. Either get them to walk or to talk, not both at once. And that's a very simple example of practical advice to carers that comes from a base of science.
Bruce.
Thanks, Camille. I found the last session absolutely fascinating in terms of, I'm really glad to be in at the beginning of this process, because we've got a real chance here to make a significant difference. And I was particularly taken by the comment of Lord Sutherland at the beginning. This is not all doom and gloom, and there's a lot of positive things happening out there. And paragraph 24 of the Royal Society's pages describes, as a society we need to consider health ageing and preventative action or care. And if you think of the more recent past and what we've done, there's an emphasis greater now in the budget on preventative care than there's ever been. We've just introduced the smoking ban a few years ago. We've now got the policy on alcohol, and all of these things, we've still to see what the implications of these will be, the positive benefits from it. But obviously, and no doubt there's much more to do in issues such as the smoking and alcohol. But one of the things I would like to know, and certainly in terms of how we approach this as a committee, where are we going to get some of the next early gains? Because if we've got a long-term problem, we've got a significant short-term problem. So where can we get some of these early gains? Is that dealing with the issues to do with obesity? Is that where we should go? Maybe Simon can help us in that regard. And what impact will things like welfare reform have on some of the gains we're making and by way of preventative spend? Because if we don't get some of that right now, the longer-term picture will be much more difficult for us. So if any of the panellists can help us on that, more positive things about where can we get some of these early gains that we can get into, as well as give us some more longer-term solutions. And as I touched on earlier, convener, I'll be really quite glad to see when we can get some of the modelling done that tells us, and it's going to be difficult, where some of these early changes, what we've done, what impacts are going to have in a more positive way.
Simon.
I think inevitably these things you try and look for your wee niche to get in, and thank you to Bruce for giving me that opportunity. I think early gains in terms of obesity is a very difficult one. I think at the moment around obesity we are firefighting in many ways and dealing with the consequence of obesity rather than looking at some of the root causes, and some of the root causes around activity and about food production and appropriate labelling are longer term challenges which we need to deal with. But many of the initiatives at the moment around child healthy weights and preventing overweight and obesity strategies, I think are there. It just takes time for them to roll out. But I'm not sure there are quick gains in that, but we have to start them. And some of the the initiatives around smoking, you don't see the gains. Well, you do see some of the gains immediately, but they're longer term gains, and we need to think. I think as strategically and long term around food as we did do about smoking, and we will do around alcohol. I think one of the other elements is around one of the things that we featured in our evidence was around malnutrition in older people, and that has been a hidden area in terms of the number of undernourished older people that there are in our communities. The squeeze on social care and on budgets around community meals is a significant issue for us. And I think one of I suppose, relatively quick wins is around nutritional screening of our older people who live in our communities. 93% of our older people, certainly who are malnourished, live in our communities, but we don't have detailed screening programs for those individuals. If you come into hospital, we do, but you don't if you live out in the community. And in order for us to try and manage some of that and deal with some of that, I think we need to identify those individuals quickly. But equally, we need to be looking at social care and the number of times I go in and see patients who have said that somebody's been in to sort their tea out and they've got 15 minutes to make their tea. And it's not practical or possible, certainly not in my household, to make something nutritional in that period of time. And whilst Meals on Wheels services offer an important service, the number of community meals that are being delivered to older people is reducing. And what a lot of older people want is that contact, and they want somebody to spend some time with them and the social contact. And it was interesting in the previous sessions, I think, Jean, you mentioned about or somebody did about lunch clubs. I think it was maybe yourself, Elaine, about lunch clubs and the ability of communities to get together. So I think there are some quicker wins in terms of malnutrition, some quick actions we can do. The obesity one, there is some firefighting we can do, and we are doing currently across Scotland. But there are some longer-term gains around obesity management that we need to look at, very carefully.
Robert Logan, followed by Anne Simpson.
I agree entirely with how firefighting is important, but particularly in terms of healthy cognition in old age, which is a major factor in independent living, it does seem as if lifespan is important. So one of the major activities in the research centre where I work is looking at longitudinal change in individuals. And the centre has data on people when they were age 11, and then following up those people now at age sort of 70, 80 plus. And it does seem as though lifestyle factors throughout life are very important for healthy cognition in old age. So I think education, active involvement, physical activity throughout life is one of the very long-term preventative strategies. And firefighting is important, but it's not going to solve the problem.
Yeah, and in your paper you say that, fractures, etc., and treating and caring for them costs £192 million a year, and you say that by 2036 there will be a 43% estimated increase on the number of fractures at current trends. And you also talk about first-line bone-protecting treatment being generic alendronate, which is cheap and effective and currently available for £14 per patient per year. So that, along with fracture liaison service, appears to be some reasonably low-cost ways of actually preventing some of these fractures. So I wonder if, in your comments, you could maybe talk about that as well.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, following on from Bruce Crawford, saying that there were some positive comments to make. The Fracture Liaison Service, which has been rolled out now to about 80% of the Scottish community, and indeed Glasgow, where it originated, has actually demonstrated a reduction in fractures. And I suppose our submission was to comment on the impact of the cost of hip fractures in particular, because that's the real costly part to the NHS and social care services if people following hip fracture who do not return to full independence, and a significant proportion of them don't. And so will need ongoing care in all sorts of ways, preferably at home. But the most elderly of the elderly will no doubt perhaps end up proportion in care homes, and a proportion of those who have had hip fractures will have dementia and will have hearing and sight problems. So you have a very all-round significant problem of quality of life in later years. An interesting point as well is we're very pleased to hear that smoking and alcohol are being addressed, because smoking and alcohol in excess, well, smoking is bad for bones, alcohol in excess is bad for bones. But I think an issue around nutrition is certainly around nutrition in the elderly and in younger populations, but in this setting in relation to bone health. Most elderly people probably have low, well, the suggestions are, well, the evidence is that most people in Scotland have low vitamin D, but also in particularly the elderly who are not out and about and managing to get the few rays of sunshine that we ever managed to have in Scotland, will not be having vitamin D. So I think that we would really like as a society to see bone health being addressed as well as obesity, because maximising bone health throughout all age groups will actually reduce the risk of the number of fractures in that very elderly population as well. But there is a positive story in Scotland. Fracture liaison services are being delivered, albeit not particularly equitable in some parts of the country, but also we're already working very well with the NHS Scotland Falls and bone health activity, which comes under the rehabilitation framework. So there's a very positive picture. We would just very much like to see the whole picture for the management of bone health, prevention of falls, prevention of fragility fractures, and looking after the most elderly to actually be equitable throughout all health board areas.
Okay. Robert Parry, to be followed by the Deputy Convener.
Thank you very much. Underpinning all this, we hear about physical disability, but the most important thing is people's psychological well-being as well. If you're actually feeling much better in yourself, your outcomes are greatly going to improve. And certainly the report, The Challenges of Delivering Psychological Therapies for Older People in Scotland, identifying that this is an important interrelationship between the comorbidity between physical health and psychological well-being. And certainly there's an underpinning bit as well around the psychosocial elements about living in poverty and about being in isolation as well. On average, evidence is telling us around 14% of older people actually suffer from depression. Similarly, anxiety and other major mental health issues in older age around dementia. So certainly these are three major issues that we could actually deal with if we could actually have further sort of development of the psychological services within the country. Certainly we could see better outcomes for people living in their own home, perhaps resulting in fewer hospital admissions, but certainly basic fundamentals of educating our professional staff and our volunteer staff. And you've heard here today already 2 examples of where NHS Education is working in partnership with 2 organisations here to actually support people in delivering psychological underpinnings to support people to keep them at home.
John, to be followed by Lord Solomon.
Hey, thanks. I mean, following on from what's just been said, I mean, both in our previous session and now, I mean, there's been quite a lot of mention, or there's been a number of mentions of the importance of community, people feeling they've got people dropping in, they've got friendships, that kind of thing. I mean, in practice, can we actually do anything about that as a finance committee? You know, is it just, you just said, we'll, you know, pay more for psychological services and so they will do that kind of thing, but I mean, some of it is the lunch clubs that are run by volunteers. I think we've had a respite was mentioned earlier on, which obviously does directly support volunteers, but are there other things we should be doing or something we should be saying about the budget that you feel would really give a boost to the communities, the families, the friends?
Mr. Parry?
Certainly what we're doing is working in partnership with the voluntary sector, the third sector, the independent sector, all organisations coming together. If you think of the initiative through the Change Fund that we've had in Scotland, whereby we were able to test out and build up community capacity, co-production, asset building in local communities. So we're certainly getting a body of evidence to, you know, to look at what's being provided and examples up and down the country and sharing examples of what can be done. So there are things that professionals, the third sector and the independent sector can actually do to support some initiatives.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to come back in. I'm not quite sure what I'm going to ask. I mean, it's just very hard to pin this down, isn't it? I mean, why is it that people used to care for their neighbours and don't care for their neighbours anymore? I mean, is that just, well, the way society's gone, do we just got to accept that, or can we actually do anything about it?
I think we can do lots of things about it. It varies up and down the country, doesn't it? There are some communities that are stronger than other communities. You look at the advent of the nuclear family, people have moved away from rural communities to more urban cities for work or whatever. But certainly there are techniques. We heard about telehealth, telecare, other ways of people staying in contact with local communities. So certainly it is about this asset building approach that we've got, and we need to carry on building those assets by looking at the examples, initiatives that have been primed through the Change Fund to actually give us examples of what's worked in certain areas.
Lord Sullivan, to be followed by Delia.
Well, returning to at least two questions, I was very taken with Bruce Crawford's challenge to us, which is a fair challenge, and also the point just raised. One of the things you as a finance committee could do is watch what's happening at local level, because the worry is when times are tight, and they're going to get tighter, that it's the voluntary organisations who are first to be cut in terms of local authority expenditure. And by and large, this is bad value for money. I mean, I'm delighted to be associated with Alzheimer's Scotland. You get more bang for your buck, if I can put it this way, with the money you put into an organisation like that, than you probably will through, you know, well, it's not a fair comparison, but formal public services, because you've got the community. It's a community built by their experience of this, of the depredations of various forms of dementia. And what they get in terms of the local support that they elicit from volunteers, because they need a bit of help, they need a bit of organising, and it's good value. Now, you as a finance committee, but nobody else could do this, could say to each local authority, how's your budget for voluntary collaboration changed? Is it a bigger percentage than it's gone down or low? Because that's what tends to happen. But very quickly on the other short-term things. Well, I mean, this discussion, I admire what your committee are doing, raising this as a matter for public discussion. That's exactly what we would expect of our politicians. Here's an example. We know how much smoking is safe, 0. We've got numbers that guide us on alcohol, 14 units, 21 units, or whatever it is. We do not have similar numbers that you can happily and easily put out to people on obesity and diet. Can you tell me what your body mass index is? I have asked various practitioners, give me a formula so I can work it out, because then at least I'd have a stick to beat myself with. And that's actually quite useful. But you know, if somebody would, to every GP, instead of having signs, well, as well as having signs up about how many units, let's have a BMI card. So we can go, oh, yeah, I'm a bit tough. And because we know about blood pressure now, we're getting better at that. And actually, these little things do affect behaviour. Two other examples. One, what happened on smoking required legislation, but it's really going to pay off. I've no doubt about that. And, you know, all credit again to the Scottish Parliament and Government that they were willing to push through with what might have seemed to some a very unpopular policy. And you just have to think similar thoughts about food. I mean, I've been involved in some of the discussions about this with the FSA and with the food industry. And they're in it to make money, I understand that. But on the other hand, there are certain ways you can either shame or constrain them, and that ought to be thought about, and it's a matter for Parliament. And can I just very quickly, two others. One, stroke. I chaired a committee in the House of Lords Science and Technology Committee report on ageing and research. One of the numbers we came up with that was frightening was that in this country, the aim was to give somebody who had a stroke a scan within 3 days. In Canada, and it's a big sprawling country, the aim was 3 hours. Now, London have cracked it. London now has a system where they're willing to guarantee pretty well that you get a scan within 3 hours. But that has required restructuring, reorganisation and channeling of budgets. Now, well within the range of Scotland to do that. And it'll be difficult if it's somebody in the Hebrides. I understand that. But not everybody lives in the Hebrides, so what are we doing about the other? And then lastly, a figure in the RSE paper that just jumped out and hit me when I first heard it. We spend 4.5 billion, roughly, we think, on support for the elderly and care. That's health and social care, 4.5 billion, of which, and the numbers in there, 1.5 billion is for unplanned hospital admissions. Now, where's the survey? Where's the check on where this is happening most, and asking the question why? Because when you get the answer to that, you could maybe change it. 1.5 billion.
I think it was first raised by the committee in August last year, away day in actual fact, and it is something we've drawn to the attention of ministers. It is something I believe that there was a focus on trying to reduce. Just before I let Delia in, Michael McMahon has asked me to convey his apologies. He has had to leave the committee. Delia.
Okay, I mean, it just occurs to me that I was thinking as people were speaking this morning that diagnosis is critical in all this, so and to allow earlier interventions. And I think we need to get better at that, because economically, if you can have this early intervention for people and give them the right information and supports, I mean, I'm arguing about people with a hearing loss, but I think that can go across the piece, and give people the tools and information to manage their own conditions. And I think as a society, maybe we've not been as good at that, and I think that's important to think about that, to give people information and support. And I would argue, obviously, that we can do that across all sectors. I think, in my experience of working in both the statutory and voluntary sectors, the voluntary sector are particularly good at that. And again, it's not an expensive intervention. But I think mental health is an important aspect that we have to seriously consider. And as people get older, and certainly with a sensory impairment, we talk about in 1 in 4 of the population in Scotland who have some sort of mental health issue. If you have a sensory impairment, that jumps to 40%. So it's significantly higher. So with, again, earlier interventions and giving people the tools and information to manage their own conditions, to support themselves and their families, I think, equally as importantly, and to understand the impact of it, it's really important. And one slightly different thing, but I think equally so, is keeping people economically active longer. We know that in Scotland, for example, people, about 135,000 people wear hearing aids at the moment who work. But a lot of the issues that are around their employers and what they know. So actually, for some information and support there, people can be economically active longer. And we know for so many reasons, it gives people self-worth, it impacts on mental health. So I think that's an area that this committee should think about, because I'm sure as it's not unique to the condition that I support, but that would go across the piece. Just last week I was speaking to the Society of Occupational Medicine, and they were really keen to get information across around sensory impairment, but I'm sure that would go across the piece. And there are actually quite inexpensive ways. For example, one situation was a nurse, and I know I'm being anecdotal, so I apologise for that, who felt she could only do night shifts because she was deaf. But I could tell them about a piece of equipment for 40. She worried that she couldn't get up early enough in the morning to phone in as well, because she didn't have a phone that worked for her. And she could do night shifts, but we could tell her about a piece of equipment that cost £40. It's a basically an alarm she can put under a pillow that will wake her up. It will shake her awake, and she can do an earlier shift. So it's really simple things that will give people, and she would buy that herself. You know, so she's really keen, really motivated, but that kind of information can keep people economically active a lot longer. And I think for that, this committee, that's worth considering as an issue.
Jean, to be followed by Simon.
Going to refer, in the last session we had, it certainly seemed that, you know, poverty doesn't help any of these situations. And if I was just thinking about the kind, about creating good habits and how we do that, where does that start? Is that all about school? Is it about cookery lessons and teaching people about dietetics when they're really young? And if we talk about preventative spend, what advice would you all have, I guess, in that way of how do we target the people who are smoking most, drinking most, eating, you know, the poorest food, which tends to be the food that's full of additives and creates obesity and so on.
You're going to come on. I know you're going to comment just now, but just while you have the floor, so to speak, I wonder if you can also talk about a point in your paper where you talk about a key role is empowering people and supporting self-care for the people in Scotland through delivery of structured patient education programmes and working in partnership with multi-professional teams across all organisational boundaries. So once you commented, I wonder if you can move on to that also.
Probably pick up that one first, or because I'll probably forget if I don't. The structured education, one of the very well-evidenced areas of work now is around diabetes care, and there's quite significant structured education programmes being put in place for people with diabetes in Scotland. Our colleagues in the last 2 weeks in Fife, 8 or 9 colleagues were away at a course looking at the expert programme for diabetics that they will be running sessions within Fife on that. And there's something called conversation maps as well that are used in diabetes care. And these are well-evidenced programmes that are being rolled out across the UK, but certainly within Scotland. And we think these well-evidenced programmes are things that could be further supported. One of the difficulties is engaging with patients in some sense and getting patients to see it as something that will be useful for them. There is quite a significant time commitment. So it's not just about having people in a position to be able to deliver that education. It's actually working with patients themselves to see their condition as their condition to self-manage, as opposed to a condition that other people will manage for them. And I think certainly around obesity management and diabetes, that is something that we are trying to drive it, even at a very local level, in terms of, you know, putting the emphasis back to the individual as to how they can see their life changing, how they can see, and trying to then, I think, hopefully direct them to the paths, whether it's around activity, whether it's around healthier eating. In Fife, we've got a really good, and there are several of these around, I think, Scotland, around community kitchen idea, that we can engage with areas of the community and people within the community who have very limited cooking skills and be able to take them into a kitchen and work with them and use food workers to do that in terms of learning some basic skills. So that was in terms of structured education. I wanted to pick up on the issue in terms of hospital admissions, and I think in 2010 the British Association of Parenteral Nutrition surveyed hospital admissions, and they found that a third of hospital admissions of patients were malnourished in the UK. This is clearly coming from the community, and those figures are stack up. And I think there is an issue around spend to save, and the reluctance within and my background is within the NHS, the reluctance with the NHS to spend to save and look at it, you know, short-term goals of achieving financial balance year on year is all well and good, but some of the longer-term spend to save initiatives are much harder to actually get boards to agree to. And while some of the funding that comes out for projects, and we've Child Healthy Weight, for example, is one, and so some of the work on for pregnant women, you know, again, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year funding, and the uncertainty that creates after, you know, year 1, year 2, in terms of how that can be then sustained. And often we're told, you know, well, it's okay, well, you know, you'll soak it into the system. We've set up clinics to look at child healthy weight, and then we have, you know, the system has to manage that afterwards. And that's very difficult because the system is stretched at the best of times. The other thing I wanted to pick up on was around, you know, in terms of self-care, in terms of what, I think John mentioned about how the Finance Committee can help. I think one of the things for me is around care is you know, it needs to come from a variety of different places, from the patient themselves, from, you know, carers want to care, and family want to care, and what they need sometimes is just that extra bit of support. Sometimes the extra bit of support is a barrier because it's not there. That extra half hour here, that ability for somebody to be taken to a lunch club or to daycare facility, or to actually have lunch with friends in another house, can be difficult. And it's sometimes those small amounts of money that are really, really important. And I think the Change Fund has been used very differently in different places. In many cases, because of the money, it's large projects to deliver services in a very different way, and that's probably appropriate. But sometimes some of the smaller projects could benefit from some of those small elements of money. Again, the difficulty with the Change Fund would be it is 4 year funding, and some of those initiatives, for them to be sustainable, I think is very difficult to achieve. The example that we've used in the submission, and certainly for dietetics, around Ayrshire and Arran, where we've spent some of the Change Fund on training home care on good nutrition and appropriate nutrition for people that they care for. The difficulty is, you know, that'll happen, but then in a couple of years' time there'll be a totally different number of home carers that we've got, and to be able to then reproduce that. So we need to get some of these things fundamental and core as part of, you know, nutrition. Nutrition is a core part of care, and I think in some of our local authorities that isn't necessarily seen as such. I think it's seen as, you know, certainly in terms of the community meal service, as a way of being able to potentially save money. I think food and, you know, the NHS would be the same in terms of hospital service and catering services. We are changing that, but it is taking time.
Robert Parry to be followed by Anne Simpson.
Point in respect to the biggest asset we have is our workforce and the staff that are engaged in delivering and supporting health and social care. There was a piece of research undertaken in the South East between NHS Fife, Lothian and Borders, and with the recognition, one of the issues that we will face is that the next 5 to 10 years, the number of people that will retire in these professional groupings, and what support services need to be developed. For instance, within Fife itself, 31% of its workforce are eligible to retire in that period. And certainly this is a big issue for the NHS boards, the workforce planners, and certainly by undertaking this piece of research, NES and the South East Education Forum were able to identify some of the things that we could actually do now about valuing people, about valuing your workforce, getting them to work differently, how they can support through their years of experience, mentorship roles, how they can actually look at alternative models of employment to enable them to retire, perhaps, and also come back into employment after a period of time. So certainly working with the workforce to help achieve in this economic climate that will be faced by a shortage of professionals to deliver these services. So certainly it is about working, it's multifaceted, you know, all these issues need to come together.
To be followed by Gavin.
Sorry.
And to follow by Gavin. No, you're excited and desperate and keen to know.
Quite catch it. No, it didn't.
It was just to emphasise the positive again from the National Osteoporosis Society that indeed working with the NHS Falls activity in Scotland and actually our network of osteoporosis specialist nurses that are in post for most of health board areas in Scotland, we're already rolling out support for for people diagnosed with osteoporosis who are newly diagnosed. And last year we actually had well over 1,000 people from out Scotland attended these sessions. Lifestyle issues are a very, very important part of complementing the clinical management for osteoporosis and prevention of fractures. So these sessions are well, usually about a half-day session, are very well received to support people who often are feeling extremely surprised and devastated by having a diagnosis of osteoporosis. They've had a fracture, had no idea it was due to osteoporosis, and are actually feeling very, very depressed at their outlook for the future. And so we have been working in partnership to try to provide information that makes them feel that they can take charge of their condition and also what they can access services locally. But I would like to also endorse the comment from Simon that there are issues at local level again where falls, for example, falls posts, and indeed some of the osteoporosis specialist nurse posts, which are really so vital to delivering the fracture liaison model, perhaps are under threat because of this outlook of short-term funding. It's simply not fair in any way to expect a specialist practitioner to be able to deliver good services when they're on, year-on contracts. And it seems such a waste of money in a way to have, for example, falls coordinators put in post. And then, within 2 to 3 years, these posts, just when the effect is beginning to be felt of the intervention and the joint working required in that each area, and then suddenly that post is away. So in some ways, perhaps the Change Fund has not been used to best advantage, and so it is about sustainability. You simply can't deliver services based on year-on funding for these posts. And it was just to endorse that and reiterate.
Gavin, you have the spotlight.
Thanks, Convener. I was just struck by something Lord Sutherland said when he talked about nutrition and comparing it to the perhaps more simple messages regarding cigarettes and alcohol. And I suppose I want to pose it to Simon. How do we get round the difficulty of conflicting messages that come across the airways when it comes to nutrition? Because I'm convinced that many people just switch off because they will hear 1 week that coffee is good for you and there's big health benefits. That, and literally a week later, there's another study that says coffee is bad for you. Eggs are very good for you. They're a great source of protein, but they're really bad for you because they're high in cholesterol. I think people do just switch off because it is more complex than the other two to start with. But because there is this conflict constantly, I think people just ignore advice, and I just wonder if there are thoughts on how we tackle that.
I think you're right, it is complex. It isn't as simple as, stop smoking. It is a more complicated issue. I think the actual message, though, and the government message, and one of the one that's been coming out from, I've been qualified for 26 years now, and actually the core message is no different in that 26. But unfortunately, I think it gets lost within the mass media. And I think, in terms of looking for a story around, the latest food and perhaps the wish for and the desire for people to have a quick fix, to find that, that secret food that just isn't there. It's about a combination of things. I think the key element is about the consistent message, and the consistent message that comes out from everybody, certainly in terms of NHS staff to Scottish Government to the boards themselves. There is a constant message there. I think it just doesn't get out, and I suppose in some sense it's not particularly exciting either. It's not an exciting message, and some of the other stories are much more. Consistency is really important, and I think that's probably what we probably should do is tap into the issue that Robert mentioned, which is about the significant number of potential ambassadors we've got out there, which is our staff. And our staff, if we just take the public service themselves in terms of our local authority staff and equally our NHS staff, the two biggest employers within Scotland, if we can channel their knowledge and channel them in terms of that's sort of a role in terms of health promotion, and for them to see their role in that health promotion and giving them resources and tools to be able to do that. That might be a way where we can tap into that from that one-to-one basis. But I think we maybe do need to take some hard decisions and some firm decisions around food and be brave. Deciding what that brave step is, I'm not certain, but I think we have been brave in other things, and perhaps in the food context we should be as well.
To make a comment on this?
I don't want to be controversial, but I can't help it here because, there may be that consistent message. I understand that, Simon, but it maybe says less fat, less sugar, less salt, 5 a day. But is the message deeper than that, or is that what the message really is? Because if it's more than that, I'm not sure I've heard it as loud as I could. And it may have been consistent, but it's how are we getting it across? So if I've got that message wrong, tell me. And from that, how on earth do we get it embedded? Because I think that's probably somewhere Gavin was coming from.
I think the message is right. I think it is how you put that message across and how you engage with the people who, in some sense, who need to hear the message. You've heard the message, and about how you then implement that message is key. But for many people that are able to do that, they're able to rationalise and they're able to look at strategies for themselves in terms of how they do it. But there is a significant number of people who struggle to take that message and then to find it possible to incorporate it into their own life for a whole range of reasons. That may be economic reasons, it may be educational reasons or information. And again, I think we need to look at some of the projects that are out there. It's about looking and identifying the good projects as opposed to concentrating on the projects that perhaps aren't working. We need to deal with that issue, but promote those good projects. The likes of things like I mentioned community kitchens. Certainly in Fife we had a report. I had a report a couple of weeks ago about the impact that had within Fife and making that available. And that type of thing may be something where we can engage with young people. Most young people will probably know what that message is around 5 a day, but how they actually then incorporate that into their lifestyles is the key to it, I think. And we need to be better at that and probably more creative at that as well.
To be followed by Lord Sutherland.
Just briefly on that, I think also people don't really know what 1 unit of the 5 a day is. I mean, you can get sort of advice that tells you half a tin of kidney beans is 1 unit. I mean, who wants to eat 2.5 tins of kidney beans? Or would they have any friends left afterwards? But the issue I wanted to touch on is, I mean, we talk a lot about, I mean, mental well-being, psychological well-being has been touched on, but I wonder whether we concentrate sufficiently on mental health issues, because obviously mental health issues are often tied in with self-destructive behaviour, like smoking, like drinking too much, and so on. And also that depression is also one of the major illnesses of old age is depression. And there's ways in which, rather than sending an old person to a doctor to get a pill to try and make them less depressed, whether there's actions that we can support. And in terms, it comes back to what you were saying about the voluntary sector and what I was saying there, the previous session about the food trade in Dumfries and Galloway, which actually uses the resource often of newly retired people who are driving, who provide support, buying, initially it was about buying food in for people who couldn't shop for themselves, extending now to gardening, to heavy housework, to changing light bulbs, to, going in to talk to people. And actually that type of social enterprise, a third sector enterprise, that actually helps not just the physical well-being of people, but the mental well-being of the newly retired and the people that they're supporting, actually, that we need to maybe make sure that we concentrate on some of those types of activity.
Respond to that. I mean, in your paper, and you've touched on it already today, you do say that there needs to be a greater emphasis on prevention of mental health problems and long-term physical conditions in later life. So, I mean, I think that's coming through loud and clear.
Yep, certainly. The report I mentioned previously identifies the comorbidities I mentioned between physical and psychological care, and certainly part of the role would be through the matrix within that report is that you prepare people the general public through a health education campaign about how to give simple psychological interventions to promote people's well-being in older age. And then professionals, work with professionals as well. The district nurse that goes in to dress the leg also. What skills can we upskill that person on psychological interventions around cognitive behaviour, the way that you actually speak to people, the way you actually promote well-being in that individual to keep them healthy. Mentally and physically. So it all builds up, but certainly it is the underpinning education that's required for the professional groupings to develop a value within them to actually support people in their own home.
To be followed by Robert Logie.
On these matters, sometimes it's complicated and it's a slow burn. It took us 50 years to take on board the research of Richard Doll on smoking. 50 years. Now, you could never have got that legislation through in 1960 or 1970 or probably 1980 because the minds of the public were not prepared. So, I mean, that's the kind of... I'm not suggesting you're going to take 50 years on the question of obesity, but it's going to take a while, and it's going to be hard work, and there's going to be effort, and there's going to be prodding and provoking. But I think the simple things like 5 a day, I mean, I may be a simple person, but I like a number like that. And then at least I can begin to track what I'm up to in terms of eating. But the contradictory advice coming through, I used to keep a little file of things that were meant to be either good for preventing dementia or actually encourage dementia. And apparently at one stage, one of the things was reading the Dundee Courier. Now, how did their PR man get that? I mean, it's a long story and I could tell you, but the range of things was just crazy. And scientists there, I'm looking across the table, scientists have to be a bit careful. Now, we got the news today that some of the big drug companies are pulling out of fundamental research and trialling on cures for dementia. And I have to say, I suspect one of the reasons is they were given over-optimistic pictures early on, because every scientist likes to be in the paper, and the papers have a responsibility too. But there has to be responsible behaviour about what you will achieve and how many years it will take to do so. But I think working at it, getting the numbers out, and taking the example of alcohol, we now know, and it is being dealt with seriously, let's do the same for food and nutrition.
In terms of dementia and Alzheimer's, Tacrin was supposed to be the drug that was going to actually change that. That was out and then it came out in the 1980s, you know. We had a report, new scientists tell this year from the University of Ulm that if you drink 3 cups of green tea a day, it prevents the formation of the plaques that cause Alzheimer's. So there's potentially that's something to at least prevent it. But we have an expert, a professor here, and he is going to speak next.
But, my comments actually are consistent with what Lord Sullivan was saying. And essentially with food, but also with cognition, the message is very complex. So it is possible to have a very simple message for smoking. There are vested interests, there are conflicts of interest. There are the companies that make their living make their profits from selling these products. That's no less true of a wide range of foods. And so the public is confronted by a wide range of very mixed and conflicting messages. So it's unclear as to what source they should take as the basis for the advice that they're given. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why it's so difficult to put across messages. The scientists themselves, of course, disagree, and that's the way that science goes. It's about debate. It's about moving forward knowledge. And getting consensus view is quite often difficult. But one of the major problems in putting across science is the difference between causal links as opposed to associations. So it's quite often, I mean, taking the example of drinking green tea, we don't know whether it's that people who are less prone to dementia are likely to choose healthy lifestyle, as opposed to the healthy lifestyle causes the lack of, lowers the propensity for dementia. And it's this difficulty of interpreting evidence, I think, is at the nub of a lot of the difficulty of putting across messages, clear messages. So I would agree entirely with the issue that Lord Sutherland raised about scientists being very careful what they say with the media. Not all scientists want to talk to the media. Some do. The ones that do might not be the best scientists to speak to the media. We don't know. But it is important to be able to evaluate evidence that comes out, to think about, is this really causal? Is it correlational? Is this something that you want to promote to the general public? And there may be some findings that are appropriate in the laboratory that are not appropriate for the general public. I've done work myself on human cognition of that kind. So it's important to think that the scientists, the practitioners and the politicians, policymakers do have a dialogue, a trialogue, have a conversation to have a real discussion about what is the science generating. How is this relevant for practice and how is it important for policy? Just last week I was giving an update lecture to the Irish Gerontological Society in Cork, and that was a mixture of scientists and of practitioners and of politicians. And there was very much the spirit of the science trying to influence policy in a rather positive way. And it seemed to me that kind of forum was really important, and it's something I think it would be nice to see happening in Scotland as well.
No one else is asked to speak, so if we want to finish the session in 10 minutes or the next 10 minutes or so. So if anyone's got any burning comments, please let me know very quickly. But you will have noticed during this session that I have seamlessly managed to quote from each of the 6 papers that were submitted in evidence to us today, except for one, and that was yours, Delia. And therefore, I just want to raise a wee point with you here, which is in terms of blindness and sight loss, you say, and I quote, that early diagnosis and treatment can prevent up to 98% of severe sight loss. So I'm just wondering what you would like to convey to the committee on that issue.
I think it just reinforces what I'd said earlier. Absolutely critical to pick up sensory impairment, both hearing loss and visual impairment, as early as possible, because there actually are relatively cheap interventions in most cases to address issues for people. Certainly in terms of hearing loss, we're not able to cure it. But our scientists, a project we funded announced last week, and they did speak to the press, that there are opportunities for regrowing hair cells and one type of hearing loss, and that's very early stages. But currently, effectively, there are no significant cures, but there are early interventions that can help address issues for people and give them the tools to manage their own conditions. And I think critically what we would argue is early intervention and giving people the tools, as you were describing, for example, in diabetes, giving people the tools to manage their own conditions is critical, and to keep people economically, for this committee's purposes, economically active as long as possible, because that's what we are being told by people. I think one of the other things that I would mention is technology. Our statutory services do, in an ad hoc fashion, use technology. I think consistency in that would be important, because that also helps people to be independent longer. I can say that my own GP a couple of weeks ago, and I don't go to my GP that often, sent me a text to remind me that I had an appointment. Really good. But in our fairly elderly, average age of 64, our membership, tell us that 62% of them use mobile phones. So it's really important to get people to do that. That kind of accessibility of statutory services is important for people. And if we can start thinking about relatively inexpensive interventions, I think, and to support people, I think that would be really important.
Thank you. So, anyone else with anything they want to bring forward? It's a going, gone scenario here. Going once, going twice. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for their contributions. According to my calculations, we've had 35 contributions from the floor, so thank you for that. And I'd also like to thank you all for your submissions as well, which were very interesting and certainly will give the members of the committee food for thought. So without further ado, I'd like to close the meeting. Thank you very much, everyone.